The world's first Latin American pope is in Mexico with daunting challenges, both for himself and his hosts. Sunday's Mass in a gritty suburb of Mexico City, a prelude to the one he'll be celebrating Wednesday in the northern border city of Ciudad Juarez, until recently dubbed the murder capital of the world. The church has some big decisions to make. For instance, do you forgive or excommunicate drug traffickers, as was done with mafia bosses in Italy? A question that will be repeated when the Pope visits one of Mexico's overcrowded jails, 1 week after yet another fatal prison riot, this one in Monterrey. And what message for a Mexican government that's recalibrated its approach with the escape and recapture of drug lord Joaquim El Chapo Guzman, while facing broader scrutiny over lawlessness and inequality, as highlighted by Francis's visit this Monday with indigenous peoples. Today, in the France 24 debate, the Pope in Mexico. With us, Mexico's new ambassador to France, Juan Manuel Gomez Robledo. Thank you for being with us. You presented your letters of credential this very day.
Yes, 2 hours ago to President Hollande.
Welcome to Paris.
Thank you very much.
Joining us from Mexico City, John Ackerman, editor-in-chief of the Mexican Law Review. Nice to see you again, John. From Pristina in Kosovo, Edgardo Buscagaglia, the author of Money Laundering and Political Corruption, The Art of Organized Crime. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And Gaspar Estrada of the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po's America's Observatory. I guess we call it like that.
Yes.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Let's start with the latest. The Pope visiting Mexico's poorest area in the south, Chiapas. 2 decades ago, you'll recall, indigenous Mayan people staged the so-called Zapatista uprising. The Pope speaking before indigenous peoples, asking for forgiveness.
Your people have been misunderstood and excluded from society. Some have considered your values, culture, and tradition to be inferior. Others, intoxicated by power, money, and market trends, have stolen your lands or contaminated them. How worthwhile it would be for each of us to examine our conscience and to learn to say, "Forgive me."
Ambassador, what's your reaction to this apology?
Well, the message of the Pope is very powerful. Mexico is a hugely important Catholic country. This is the 7th visit of a Pope, a visit which we called from the very beginning of his pontificate. And Pope Francis has a very important message of peace, of reconciliation, of forgiveness. This is a year of charity and forgiveness. And we are very happy that of his visit and the fact that he has taken 6 or 7 days to literally go to a number of places in the country. Of course, he will be visiting, he's in Chiapas, he will be visiting also Chihuahua and Michoacan and the state of Mexico. This is a very important visit to us. Mexico has also a very important relationship with the Holy See.
But this asking forgiveness to the indigenous communities?
Well, the indigenous have been, of course, no one can deny that, subject to a number to a pattern of discrimination, and that is something that we acknowledge. And they are the poorest among the poor, and we are working to redress that. Mexico is now considered and identifies itself as a pluricultural and multi-ethnic society. And we have important public policies that address indigenous peoples and their needs.
John Ackerman, what do you make of the Pope's apology?
The Pope has been very poetic and in favor of social justice and
in Mexico, not only in Chiapas, but also his speeches this weekend in Mexico City and in the suburbs of Mexico City. The problem is that he has been perhaps too polite with really responsible actors for the disaster, which is today Mexico: violence, corruption, forced disappearances, which is precisely the Mexican government. I hear the Mexican government ambassador Gonzalo Robledo very, very happy with the visit of the Pope. This is precisely the problem. By maintaining himself at a completely philosophical or theoretical level, he has not gotten directly at the grain, at the center of the problem. In Mexico, we have a situation in which it's increasingly difficult to distinguish between organized crime outside of the state and organized crime within the state. Just this last week, the 15th journalist was assassinated in the state of Veracruz. This is a state run by the same party of the federal government, Peña Nieto, by Javier Duarte. It's one of the states which is most dangerous for journalists in the entire world. On January 2nd this year of 2016, a new young mayor, optimistic, idealistic mayor of Temisco in Morelos, was assassinated in cold blood the day after she had promised to combat organized crime. We have to face the fact that the problem in Mexico is not just chaotic narcos at the local level. The narco politics and money laundering has gone all the way up to the top. And the Pope,
but before we go more into specifics about the whole issue of drugs, just a point on this asking for forgiveness to indigenous people, because it is the area of Mexico that is the poorest. What does that message mean?
Well, the Mexican government should follow up and also apologize for the incredible destruction of indigenous cultures and poverty. This is the reason why the indigenous people of Chiapas are so poor and exploited, is because of the neoliberal policies driven particularly strongly by the present administration, which has led to the destruction of the sustenance for the indigenous people and their exclusion from national development. So I think it's great that the Pope apologizes. The problem is that the Mexican government and political class also needs to apologize and actually do something about it, instead of just hiding behind, laws and policies which supposedly resolve the problem in the long term, but don't do anything to actually attend to the humanitarian crisis in Chiapas and throughout Mexico, which is happening right now.
Ambassador Robledo, when you look at the books, Mexico's wealth has increased, but places like Chiapas have been left behind.
Oh, they have. They have. Over the last 20 years, there's been a great deal of social progress. But of course, more needs to be done.
Should there be an apology, like John Ackerman suggests?
Well, I think that it is very good from the Pope to ask for that apology. What the government and the state and the society must do is to implement a number of policies, which are, as he rightly says, in the books, in the codes. But there's a need for more implementation and to build a better culture of human rights. But no one can deny that Mexico is a solid democracy with institutions, with a separation of powers, and we are doing whatever it takes to promote the rule of law in the country. It will take time. It will take time. But we are putting in place a number of institutions, a number of legal reforms, and more, with the help of a vibrant civil society, which is very active, things are starting to change on the field.
All right.
Well, I think that actually the Mexican economy has been polarizing since the NAFTA agreement, and states like Chiapas clearly were not advantaged by this agreement, in terms that the economic mix and the economic trend of Mexico has been really linked with the development of bilateral relations between Mexico and the United States, and that has been helping states like Chihuahua, for instance, to develop themselves, but all the states, southern states of the country, had lack of growth, and that could explain actually that anger that exists in states like Guerrero, where you had the crime of the former professor of Ayotzinapa, because those states are basically driven by drug lords that give money to those population that have no actual normal economic activities, because they're not linked with actually the progress of the Mexican economy, which is really linked with this bilateral relation between Mexico and the United States.
All right. After the visit to Chiapas, there's Guadalajara, where he'll touch on the issue of migration, and Ciudad Juarez, as we mentioned on Wednesday, where he'll visit a prison and celebrate Mass there, that town near the border. In Mexico City, the Pope visiting a children's hospital in the company of personalities that included First Lady Angelica Rivera and the son of Mexico's richest man, telecoms tycoon Carlos Slim. Let me ask you, Edgardo Buscaglia, because I feel like we're having the same kind of conversation we had when the Pope visited the United States, which is the question of, is the Pope left-wing or right-wing?
The Pope is a sensible person. I mean, he's trying to convey a sense of social justice to a Mexican political elite that is literally detached from reality, from the reality of the average woman or the average person in that country. Mexico is a country suffering from an armed conflict. Armed conflicts are defined by the Geneva Convention. I mean, Mexico is a country with more than 27,000 forced disappearances. Mexico is a country with more than 50% of their people are poor or extremely poor. Mexico is a country where you have a sub-Saharan reality, an African reality, when the Mexican political elite is behaving as if they were part of the French elite. You have a problem, you have detachment from the real world coming from the political elite in Mexico, and the Pope is just conveying a sense of social justice and scolding the Mexican elite for not grabbing this problem and starting to solve it. I've been hearing the same speech for decades in Mexico. I mean, the ambassador should be hired by Disneyland in France because, he's conveying a fantasy reality. And Mexico is a country where you have more than 27,000 forced disappearances. This brings you to the level of the disappearances of the dictatorship in the Southern Cone. So the Pope is trying to be diplomatic. He's a chief of state. I mean, he cannot just go around like a civil society activist, but he's conveying a message of justice, the sense of desperation that millions of people are feeling in that country.
And Edgardo, on that point, ahead of the visit, a Mexico City cleaning woman quoted by the Christian Science Monitor as saying he has a reputation for speaking his mind, and you know the problems of Mexico, there's a lot he could say. Is he going to ultimately, is this visit going to have an impact?
I think so. Mexico has a very fragmented civil society, unfortunately. The government just allocates a lot of money in making sure that civil society stays fragmented. So you have this caviar civil society in Mexico participating in conferences and workshops. And then you have the real civil society that is literally assassinated, kidnapped, suffering from extortion. So the Pope has the potential to become a catalyst of union within a civil society. So we can start seeing the same kind of civil society movement that we saw in Italy during the 90s or in Colombia during the last decade, where millions of people demand all those reforms that are still absent in Mexico. Mexico is a country with dozens of state vacuums. In other words, institutions that do not exist. And the elites, the political elite, have been benefiting enormously from those vacuums. So they're not state vacuums by chance. Therefore, you have an electoral system that allows dirty money to go just to flow into the system. And you may have a facade of democracy with electoral competition, but in reality, you have organized crime placing their candidates. You have dirty money going left and right all over the place in all parties, not just the president's party. So you have a country with huge state vacuums that benefit the elite, and the Pope has been making sure that he scolds the elite, that is calling for the elite to clean up their act. So
Ambassador Robledo.
Well, I'm afraid I cannot agree with a number of points made. First of all, Mexico has had a change of party in power 2 times in the last 15 years. First. Second, if you compare the state of organization of civil society 20 years ago with what we have right now, there is an enormous progress. Of course, more needs to be done, but civil society is part of the daily decisions made in the country.
Do you agree it's not gone as far as places like? Do you agree that it's not gone as far as places like Colombia, where they too have an armed conflict, they too have violence?
I cannot agree either to the fact that there is an armed conflict in Mexico. What we have is a very important violence in very specific areas, violence that comes from organized crime, and that is something that is known, and everyone knows what the origins of these organized crime are. And I don't have to remind you about the flow of guns coming from the United States. I don't have to remind you about the demand of illicit drugs in the United States. I don't have to remind you that once the United States blocked the entrance of illicit drugs through the Caribbean and the Pacific, the main route for illicit drugs is Mexico's land. We have become a country that is a producer, a country of transit, and also, unfortunately, an increasing consumer country.
John Ackerman.
Well, the ambassador says that everybody knows where the organized crime comes from. You look at any poll, Latin Barometer, Transparency International, and the consensus among the Mexican population is that the central source for organized crime and abuse of power is the government, not society. Just this last Thursday, you mentioned it, Francois, there was an enormous prison riot, the largest in recent history in Mexico, perhaps Latin America. 49 inmates killed each other. This was reported as a fight between criminal gangs. Well, yes, it was, of course, but who's in control of a maximum security prison? These are the government authorities. How was El Chapo Guzman, about 7-8 months ago, allowed to dig a tunnel underneath the maximum security wing of the most highest security prison in the entire country and escape and remain escaped for 6 months? And this last January 8th, he was captured, of course, but by accident. The approach on his house was a failure. He escaped once again through a hole underneath his safe house. Mexico is literally falling apart. If you look at...
All right, John, I'm going to interrupt you very quickly because we have to take a very quick break. We'll pick up on that point. You're watching the France 24 debate.